I think it's always quite daunting to follow a session of 4 presidents, but we'll try to do our best and not disappoint. As Henry said earlier this morning, and also President Obasanjo, this conference isn't about whether there is growth in Africa. I think that's a given. And actually, I sort of very politely banned my panelists from quoting the 7 out of 10 growing economies, da-da-da. It's quite clear from growth rates, from increasing foreign investment, that there is growth. I think the question really is how deep and sustainable, broad and inclusive this growth is. So this panel is going to discuss some of the factors that will need to ensure the depth and breadth of the current growth, focusing on how effectively and efficiently the economies in African countries can be diversified, and with a particular focus also on the middle class. We'll also look at some of the support that's needed to ensure this effective, sustainable growth, particularly looking at financial support through the banking systems and also some technology. It was interesting when President Mahama this morning was asked which sectors did he recommend for investment, and he said everything. So I thought it would be good to have a little bit more about the specifics on the what and the how, and hopefully this panel can provide that. So just to introduce the panelists, first of all, I have Ms. Jin Kwanzaa, Vice President of the China Africa Development Fund. Next to her is Dougie Brew, who's Corporate Affairs Director for Africa at Unilever. Next to him is Cameron Siddiqui, who's the Group Executive Central Europe, Middle East and Africa for Visa. Next to him is Phil Jenkins, who is the Chief Financial Officer, Africa for Diageo. And then finally, but not least, is Dr. James Mwangi, who's CEO and Managing Director of Equity Bank. Some of the issues that we'll be covering, we'll look particularly at the definition of the middle class. I think Henry gave you one definition earlier, but I think the panelists have various views on this. This is because the middle class in Africa, I guess as everywhere else, are recognized as a vital source for the catalytic economic growth required. We'll also look at how the collective power of Africa's 1 billion person economy can be harnessed. We'll look also particularly about what is appropriate value addition and what will it take to realize this. We heard earlier President Museveni speaking about refineries in Uganda and the debate about whether he should have 1 or 7 or any at all. So we'll start off with each of the panelists given a brief 5, maximum 6-minute speech, and I've politely told them that as much as I'm in awe of each and every one of them, I will interrupt when the 6-minute break is up. I will then use my moderator's privilege to ask them a few questions and then throw it open to the panel. But we've decided that we'll have very much a very interactive and conversational type of panel. So just starting with Kwanzaa. Yes, if you go up there, thank you.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is a great pleasure for me to attend this meet and share my views with you. Based on my understanding, the topic we are addressing for this session, diversifying Africa's economies, is very important for the sustainable development of Africa in the long run. At a scheme of 2006 Beijing Summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, China-Africa Development Fund, CAD Fund, is sponsored by China Development Bank and under operation for more than 7 years, with the missions of facilitating China-Africa cooperation and the development of Africa. We have committed approximately $3 billion in 80 projects covering over 30 countries, with a total investment of nearly $20 billion. I'm quite confident that our investment activities have bridged Africa's investment gap to a certain extent. During the last 7 years, we have witnessed tremendous opportunities in Africa, which already demonstrates the start of Africans' economic diversification. First of all, the continuing investment in infrastructure, such as power plant, water supply, and the transportation, provides foundations of development of other sectors. For instance, a power plant we have invested in Ghana has eased considerably the power shortage in the country and played an important role to facilitate its industrial development. Secondly, agriculture and the agri-processing sectors can be identified as priorities for most African countries. From the supply side, Africa owns plenty of land, proper weather, and young labor force. From the demand side, with the growing population, the need of quality food is increasing. We have invested in several agricultural projects in Africa. All of them have diversified the local economies and brought new technologies and skills to the local communities. Thirdly, selected manufacturing sectors in line with African countries' demand, natural resources, and competitive advantages can be prioritized at their development strategies. We have invested quite a lot of projects producing consumer goods, such as automobile and household lines in a number of countries to respond to the market demand. Meanwhile, to advocate investment for diversification, policymakers need to work hard. One thing need to do is creating a consistent and predictable policy environment. As an equity investor, normally we will hold our investment for 8 years, sometimes even 10 to 15 years. Therefore, the sustainability of the investment policies is one of the key elements to our success. Another effort needs to be made is providing friendly environment and strong support to investors, especially foreign investors. As a foreign investor, normally we would face more risks than the local players, such as the foreign exchange risk and the political risk. Therefore, strong support from the government will boost our confidence and help to mitigate risks. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, with the eager of development and the increasing needs of consumption, Africa, we all believe, is a continent full of hope and opportunities. In order to promote China-Africa cooperation and the development of Africa, CAT Fund is willing and open to work together with all parties, governments, international institutions, and entrepreneurs. Thank you very much.
Becky?
Right, ladies and gentlemen, pleasure to be here today with you, and particularly in such a wonderful building. Now, if you were to take a stroll out of this building and turn to your left and walk along the Thames, you come across another wonderful building, Unilever House, big Art Deco building, completed in 1933, by which time Unilever had already been on the continent for quite a considerable length of time. We're there in 18 countries, we manufacture in half of them, and our brands are sold right the way across the continent. Brands many of my African colleagues grew up with, Lifebuoy, Omo, Blue Band. New innovations coming through, Nigerian Niger Gel toothpaste, Stop Cubes, Knorr Stop Cubes, specifically flavoured to meet fasting requirements in Ethiopia's 200 days a year of fasting. Our small trading schemes, our women entrepreneurship schemes from Asia that we're moving across. So there's a lot happening there. A big global procurement operation is running there. And we're also heavily focused on sustainable business. We've recently just finished our zero hazardous waste to landfill site in Ghana. But the key is how that sustainable business works with consumers. The consumers are where we're at. That's the new economy, the new jobs, and the new way of thinking. And feeding down to that grassroots and getting it going is where we create economies. And there are two key points that I want to make about that. And the first one is that people look at us as Unilever as the manufacturing investment. We are merely the tip of an iceberg. We're part of an ecosystem. Services, retail, suppliers, advertising, marketing, finance, IT, suppliers of everything from packaging, plastics, chemicals, agriculture, logistics, retailers, top and bottom, large scale, the growing medium supermarkets, the small traders, right down to the general trade and wholesale. There's an enormous scale out there, which as we build up, we're not servicing the middle class, we're also creating the middle class at the same time. And that's quite a shift in terms of where we're going, in terms of investment conferences. The old paradigm that we were faced with regularly was resource-based GDP creates cash into the economy, so you create manufacturing, you build products, you get them out to people. As a consumer goods company, we think entirely the other way. What are the consumers and the people wanting? How do we feed back into them? And that is the key to releasing the power of the middle classes and where we're going within Africa. It means addressing a lot of the tedious parts of legislation, going off the big political statements, going on to product registration, onto IP, onto creating a medium scale of business within there who can work with us in that entire ecosystem. And that consumer that we're going to, that shift from the top-down planning of an economy to the bottom-up planning is equally the key to where the growth of Africa is going to come from. We're not massively convinced by the debate about middle class in Africa. There's a comparison lurking in there, which is comparing income levels to elsewhere and saying, well, is it the same in Africa or not? Probably less of an issue. The point is there are a lot of Africans out there who are entering a consuming class and who we can work with. They may spend less, they may look different, they may have different consumption patterns, but they are in every way exactly the same as every consumer on the rest of the planet. So if we look there, and we have the measures to get that ecosystem in place, then we have a real chance to fire up the economies in Africa. If you take the history of my own company, Lord Lever taking it from a small soap-making business off in the northwest of England down to a global company working here at headquarters down the road, we can do the same thing within Africa. We can take a relatively small consumer goods sector and we can turn it from being a service to the economy to being a global powerhouse. And that is where I would like to see some of the debates heading in the investment on how we make that happen and how we create that network of ecosystem suppliers and legislation that we need as a company to thrive. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to participate on this panel exploring such an important topic, the diversification of Africa's economies and serving the emerging middle class. Last month, the Financial Times ran a blog asking whether the near two-decade period of African growth has been the result of temporary market forces, such as commodity prices, or did it in fact herald a more sustained and pervasive shift brought about by genuine economic diversification for a sustainable future? The question it asked was, Africa is rising, but for whom and for how long? Since Visa came to Africa in 1968, we have witnessed substantial efforts from governments to diversify the economies. Indeed, we have been a part of these efforts. I recently saw two indicators suggesting that these efforts are bearing fruit. The first is the emergence of frontier as opposed to emerging markets. In 2013, the frontier market index rose 26%, while the index for emerging markets fell by almost 3%. According to the ESA-DE Geocenter for Global Economy and Geopolitics, this is partly due to frontier markets moving from commodity-oriented growth to economies that emphasize innovation and knowledge. As Kenya and Nigeria are among these frontier markets, it stands to reason that others in Africa are following their example, if not leading them in diversification, creating a general continental shift towards more stable, knowledge-based economies. The second indicator is a report from Standard Bank indicating that the number of middle-income households in 11 key sub-Saharan African countries, excluding South Africa, are set to triple to 22 million by 2030, thereby creating a burgeoning middle class. The report adds that if we add in lower middle income households, the number rises to 40 million households by 2030. So Africa seems to be rising for the right reasons, so the question now becomes, how do we sustain that growth and broaden its reach across the entire population spectrum, not just an urban middle to upper segment of society? Unsurprisingly, Visa believes that a payments mechanism remains an essential piece of plumbing for a diversified, knowledge-based, and inclusive economy, creating efficiency, security, and reliability across a number of important economic sectors. A payment system is the foundation for future commerce, be it online, on the high street, or mobile. A payment system stimulates innovation, especially in mobile payments. It enables greater efficiencies in government services or benefits disbursements, and it creates more financially aware consumers. A payment system enables economies to integrate and connect to boost trade, knowledge, and cooperation. Electronic payments help economies grow. Moody's research found that between 2008 and 2012, greater usage of electronic payment products added almost $1 trillion to GDP in the 56 countries studied. The study also found that card usage raised consumption by an average of almost 1%. Looking forward, a future 1% increase across the countries Moody's surveyed would produce an annual increase of almost half of 1% in consumption and almost 1/3% increase in GDP. African economies remain largely informal, with studies suggesting that up to 90% of business lies in the gray economy. And by this, I don't mean criminal activity. This is the economy of micro businesses, people selling food, working at local restaurants, plumbers, people delivering parcels, offering tourist services, and washing cars. The informal system is almost entirely cash-based, and the result is not only a loss of tax revenue, but also a loss of substantial data to help investors really understand the data to help understand the opportunity of investing in Africa, as we just cannot track large amounts of economic activity. Plastic cards are unlikely to enable us to bring more financial services to more Africans. Innovation, particularly mobile, now gives us the best chance we have ever had to democratize payments and include more people in the formal financial system. It was African ingenuity which created the proliferation of mobile money systems, which have found their home turf here. Visa is enormously respectful of the inventiveness of the African mobile network operators and mobile money technology companies in developing a viable market. Visa can add value to those systems through the benefits of our network, security, interoperability, and linking to banking products. Africa will continue to be a place where new ideas are incubated. Investors are no longer asking themselves whether they should invest in Africa, but rather how. The right regulatory environment with strong public-private partnership organized around shared values and goals is critical to this. The government of Rwanda, under His Excellency the President, will attest to this. The Rwandan vision is a bold one, aimed at nothing less than the modernization of its economy and the transformation of Rwandan society for all its citizens. Visa and the government of Rwanda signed a charter in 2011 to work together to build payments infrastructure that would support this transformation. Projects of this nature take time and hard work. They also take the right environment for businesses to be able to make a long-term investments for the benefit of society. Investors need regulatory certainty. In our world, governments are at the vanguard of trying to work out the right regulatory balance for payment systems and new financial products, getting the balance right between protecting the consumer and distorting the market is a fine line and not always easy to achieve.
Cameron.
Investment and innovation thrive in places that have been willing to first allow the market to develop and then introduce the right regulation in order to ensure important principles of consumer protection. Visa is keen to work very closely with government in a continent of optimism, drive, and ingenuity. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a privilege to be here today, and I promised not to mention 7 out of 10. Diageo has been selling its products in Africa for over 200 years, and Africa is very much an investment destination for Diageo. We have a very healthy £1.5 billion business, which is broad-based in terms of geography and product segments. And it's fair to say that we are very much sold on the continent. We have 6,500 people in East Africa, West Africa, and Southern Africa. 14 integrated manufacturing sites, and we've invested around £1 billion in the continent over the last 5 years. So I think that demonstrates our commitment to the development of our business there. You'll hear a lot of statistics today, no doubt. And I think for consumer goods companies in particular, investing in Africa is not an incredibly difficult decision, as it isn't in some other emerging markets. We believe in the economics, we believe in the demographics, and we believe that development of the continent is compelling. So lots of statistics. Africa has been growing on average about 3 times faster than developing economies. Per capita income over the last 10 years has grown by 30% in real terms, compared with a 10% decline in the previous 20 years. Consumer spending is increasing significantly. I think McKinsey carried out a piece of research recently that suggested that consumer spending would increase from about $830 billion in 2008 to $1.4 trillion by the time we get to 2020. And to put that into context for a business like ours, in the next 10 years, the equivalent of the UK population will enter legal drinking age and enter into our industry. The last thing in terms of statistics, particularly for multinationals entering into markets for the first time, the speed of urbanisation in some markets, up to 50% of people will be working and living in cities in the next 10 years. And certainly in terms of accessing the consumer, that makes things a lot more straightforward for us. We know that the development of these markets is not a straight line. We also know that simply reading the GDP statistics is not a simple way to express the story. But as I say, we're confident in the development of the continent. I just wanted to talk about 2 things briefly in terms of how we see sustaining our business in Africa beyond the commodities boom. The first area that we're very focused on and we believe is critical to the development of our business is the development of talent and the development of local talent. We believe in local talent, we believe in local leadership, and we believe in local insight. And that's a core part of the way that we operate across the continent. 70% of our senior managers across the continent are African. And we believe that's massively important in terms of being close to the consumer in the individual markets that we operate. and we believe in building talent through formal investment and through talent programs. So we've employed something like 500 graduates across the system since 2008, and we have career programs on early career, mid-career, and for senior managers. I was talking to one of our Future Leaders program members last year who's been in the business for 3 or 4 years and has moved to Shanghai in our audit function in Shanghai and is learning all about control and compliance in that region, and we'll bring that back to Africa. We're talking about what he'll do next in his next role, and we think that's a massively important part of what we're doing. So talent is a critical part. The last thing I would say is, and we've touched on it, I think, in terms of the other panelists, sustainable development is also a massive part of what we do, being linked into local communities. 50% of our raw materials are sourced locally, and we believe that makes sense in terms of the development of local communities, and we believe that makes business sense in terms of value for money, in terms of managing foreign exchange risk, and in terms of managing logistical challenges in some of the markets in which we operate. We purchase cereals from around 100,000 farmers across Africa, and we believe in driving value through the value chain, so not just through the farming system, but also through distributors and retailers. And finally, we believe in being connected with the local investment community. We believe in the development of capital markets and being able to access local liquidity in order to drive the investment in our businesses across the continent. So those are our points of focus. Look forward to talking further on Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really a privilege to participate in the subject of diversifying African economies, and particularly serving the emerging middle class. Equity Bank, an initiative in the East African region, is all about this initiative. It's all about intermediation, mobilizing resources, and involving local communities in diversifying their economies, in active participation, and seeing what can be harnessed from the collective power of the 1 billion persons living in Africa. Equity has been able to mobilize funds now in excess of $4 billion from local communities, and in partnership with other providers of capital, and the process provided back to the same communities, those who have deficits, so that they can actualize their dreams and aspirations. In the process, we're seeing increasing diversification in terms of involvement and engagement in the economy. As the President earlier said, in the past we have had the government, or African governments, being the biggest investors in African economies. We're now increasingly seeing a lot of the private sector driven initiatives, and consequently putting the economies in the hands of the private sector. It is the funding of those dreams that will see greater and greater market-based solutions that would sustain these economies beyond the massive extractive industry operations happening in Africa. When our resources are over, it will be the private sector-driven solutions in providing services, in agro-processing, in processing that we will see being holding and strengthening the economies. We are seeing increasingly, as the President Museveni said, massive investment in infrastructure. And that then provides us with a massive platform to get the private sector to take advantage of the enabling environment that is emerging. And Equity's biggest responsibility is then to fund the private sector in that participation. The second one is for Equity is to champion development of policies and infrastructure that would support this sector. And Equity is listed on the Nairobi Stock Exchange. It's the biggest bank now on Nairobi Stock Exchange by market capitalization, approximately $2 billion US. And deepening that market is what eventually will help us get long-term capital, again, that we should be able to provide financing for long-term, and particularly value addition in long-term industries, or industries that require long gestation periods. It is the capital markets growth that we also see deep capital in the African continent that would then help in financing what will eventually be the value addition enterprises that will be within the market. So in a nutshell, that is what Equity is doing. I just want to add my last 1 minute by saying the experience of Equity is that Africa is a ripe investment destination. We now have approximately 10 million customers, as I said, with a fund of $4 billion US. But we have been able to sustain a return on asset in excess of 5% for over 5 years, and a return on equity in excess of 30%, placing us the bank in Africa with the highest return on equity and the highest return on assets. So again, a demonstration that despite the challenges that still remains on the African continent, the opportunity for investment, the opportunity for high return, commensurate with the risks that might be there, is present in Africa. And I want to extend an invitation. I've read Equity for the last 20 years, and from my experience, I want to find a better market to operate in. Welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, gentlemen and Gwanza. You all managed to keep within the 5-minute period, except Cameron, but anyway, I forgive you for that. Anyway, just moving on. Dougie, you said that Unilever was not just servicing the middle class, but is making the middle class. And I just wondered whether there's actually enough that is being done, not simply to satisfy the consumption needs of the middle class, but also to empower them to be able to create businesses that create jobs, and that could lead to this sort of deeper and more inclusive growth that we are discussing here, a more diversified economy.
My feeling is not figured enough in investment discussions, nor in discussions of value added, which tend to be fairly simplistic about end of pipe coming out of a manufacturing operation. If you look at the income spectrums across Africa, you tend to get about 30 million people at the top, the haves, the affluent, who may be buying premium, buying more. You get about 40 million in the middle, the aspiring middle classes who are looking to purchase more. And you have this big block of 650 million at the bottom who are generally listed as have-nots and striving. And that's where your market is. The middle classes is where your potential to release that market is. It's creating that middle class, that network and ecosystem of suppliers that we need. We've got a lot of very large and very small industries. It's the medium-scale logistics in the medium-sized towns. It's the ad agencies. It's the local workers that we need to really set this going. So in answer to your question, no, I think that's an underplayed aspect of both regulation and investment decisions, which needs to be part and parcel of the much broader logistics.
So as this is very much a practical, solution-driven conference, what would you say practically needs to be done to increase the efforts to create that empowered middle class?
I think it's very hard at an Africa level to have a meaningful, concrete discussion. It's both a regional level within the East African community, within the ECOWAS community, and it's very much a national level. Are your tax laws the right ones in place to allow people to grow those kinds of firms? It's individual legislation pieces on product and brand registration. You and your neighbours, do you have one saying you require a label of 2 centimetres, another requiring 2.5 centimetres? So it needs to break down and get much more local. And unfortunately, it's far less sexy. People love the grand political gestures, but it's actually the day-to-day tedium of IPR conferences, of investment and finance, of mobile banking that we need to get into.
Okay. Phil, is there anything you want to add to that? I've said this is a sort of interactive thing, so if any of you have anything more to add to that question.
I guess actually we're in the same place, I think, in terms of thinking about the consumer. I think the emerging middle class measurement is a measurement of general growth in the economy, but for consumer goods businesses, I think accessing the mass consumer is as important, if not more important, than accessing the emerging middle class. Particularly, if you think about some of the stats in our industry, in some markets around 50% of alcohol is illicit. And it's people trading through that spectrum into the formal segment, into our value brands, that to a certain extent drive some growth. So I think you have to take a broad-based approach to the consumer.
Okay, thank you very much. And Kwanzaa, just hearing about your interest and investments in Africa, we've heard a lot of talk about the importance of having the right amount of infrastructure and quality of infrastructure to help this diversified economy. And I believe your fund, the CAD, invests a lot in infrastructure. Now, considering the perceived or even real risks in Africa, what sort of factors do you look at to ensure that you are investing in infrastructure projects that are I guess, going to really give you the return that you want? And also, what do you do in order to mitigate whatever risks are associated with that sort of investment?
Well, we do invest in a number of infrastructure projects. And when we're considering projects in general, or infrastructure projects, in principle, we need a Chinese investor to co-invest with us. Because we understand the Chinese companies and enterprises well. So because the business leader is very crucial to the success of the project. That's one element. And another one is political system. For infrastructure investment, we will stay for quite a long time. So the political system is very important to us. Then for projects, we need to be bankable. For infrastructure projects, normally the investment is quite huge compared with other manufacturing projects. So it should be bankable. We need to get financed. We need to close the finance. I think that's some criteria, not much difference from other private equity investors.
And what do you do as your fund to really understand the whole context of Africa, whether it's political, socioeconomic? I mean, how do you get your data, your information?
Well, we have been operating for 7 years, so we learn a lot from our own experience. So at the macro level, we do have a research department which help us to understand in the general scale. And also we have 4 on-ground teams in Africa. We have 1 representative office in South Africa, another in Ethiopia, 1 in Zambia, and 1 in Ghana. So those offices help us to understand the local political, economic environment better. And also, we cooperate with a lot of Chinese companies. And they also have team on ground. Some of them have more than 10 years experience in Africa. I think all of those help us to understand the business in certain countries.
Okay, thank you very much. I just realized that we're almost running out of time, and I don't want to deprive the audience of asking you questions. So, though I had lots of questions for you, as you know, I'm going to turn to are there microphones around for people? So if there are any questions in the audience, please say who you are and direct it to who you want. There's a gentleman over there. Thank you.
Hi, Tamer Saeed from THS Partners. I have a question for Mr. Siddiqui. I was very interested to see that announced a few weeks ago in Nigeria the idea of identity cards, which are also a combined payment card, which sounds like a fantastic idea to really get plastic out to the masses. So the question is really, is that something that you think will be successful? And secondly, is it something that you could look to emulate as Visa potentially in Rwanda, given that you have a very strong relationship there with the government? Is that something that you think could be a catalyst for really getting more of the population into the formal financial sector? Thank you.
Yes, so we're working on several ideas and across Africa. And the key here is that there's no one single idea, no one single product construct that answers the question or helps solve the problems for either for governments, payments, and so on. So we have a pilot in Rwanda that we're working on that uses mobile phones. So I think the answer is that it's important not to think in binary terms about product ideas. As you can see in innovation today, it's the cumulative effect of a number of different product constructs, number of different ideas that can come together over time, and some will be more successful than others. And I think it is accepting the idea that we will constantly be in a cycle of innovation, and innovation cycles are getting shorter. So to answer your question, what the government of Nigeria is doing is a very interesting idea. We've seen some of those ideas in other parts of the world. What the government of Rwanda is doing, which is slightly different, is interesting. And we want to be part of the enablement architecture, because ultimately we offer a globality and interoperability, so people can transfer money to whomever they like, whenever they like, wherever they like. And we'll see, of all of these ideas, there may be several that succeed. But most specifically, when it comes to identification and payments, it's important for us to create alternatives. And we're talking to governments, including Nigeria, on alternatives. There are many ways to do this. So the answer is we have to do a lot of things well, and we have to continuously find new ways to do that. And that's how we do it through our partnership with governments.
Thank you very much. My name is William Masiko from Investment Climate Facility for Africa. My question really is to you, Rosalind, perhaps to decide who you want to direct it to on your panel. We've heard a lot about, the great growth we're seeing in Africa, and we've had very many positive stories, rightly so, from your panelists. My question is, there are obviously some challenges. And, we heard President Museveni this morning say, imagine how fast Africa could be growing if we, removed these barriers to investment. What are some of the barriers? And, the governments are saying we're looking to the private sector to create jobs. This growth over the last 10 years has created very few new jobs. And, what do you think is the solution there? What would you tell these leaders to do for you to be able to create these jobs? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that question, William. It was a question I actually was going to ask James, so thank you for preempting and reading my mind. Dr. Mwangi, would you like to answer that, particularly bearing in mind that in order to have this non-jobless growth, people will need to have access to finance, whether personally or for growing their businesses. So if you could answer William's.
Thank you very much. It is true that Africa's growth is constrained by a couple of challenges. And we need not repeat the ones that were stipulated in the morning, but for the sake of summarizing them, there is a question of infrastructure. And infrastructure, the biggest challenge is energy. Energy is not really sufficient. There are also soft infrastructure like security. The issues of consistently the private sector providing itself with the security is really not an optimal way. There is the question of ports and the efficiency of our ports, the road network and efficiency of use of roadwork, the railway infrastructure, and all that and even telecommunication. But I think it is the soft factors, things like policy and policy consistency that really needs to be addressed in the continent, such that there is predictability when you are doing things and there is consistency in application of the same policy. The second one is the issue of integration of the African economies. It's great, but none of us can be able to set a factory in every of the 53 countries in Africa, given that we're talking of a market of 1 billion people. And it's a lovely number to talk about. But when you go down to the continent, you find that the number is fragmented in 53 economies. Economies that have barriers that you need nearly 29. Personally, I need about 29 visas to move from one country to the other. Those are the barriers that needs really to be addressed, such that we can have a single market. The question of interconnectedness of the economy, it was not a joke that saying moving from one neighboring country to the other, you might need to first of all come to Europe so that you are able to go to the neighboring. Those are the challenges that of interconnectedness. And lastly is the issue of economic reforms. The issue of stability of the microeconomic environment is always sometimes underestimated. That you need stable inflation, you need stable interest rates, and you need stable exchange rates. If we could be able to harmonize that economic parameters and they become very predictable, then globalization becomes fairly easy, because Africa is it's increasingly getting globalized. But then you see, and lastly is the partnership that Africa needs to form with the rest of the world. You find like now East Africa has a partnership, an export partnership with Europe, and suddenly it expires and it has not been negotiated, and you see a huge challenge affecting existing businesses. Those are the main concerns that I would say the private sector would require.
If I may just add something from the perspective of payments, which is the business Visa is in, governments are playing an increasingly active role in payments, as they should. And here's the challenge, and we hope to work with governments to solve that, is that in a rapidly changing world where technology is going to fundamentally change the way we interact through mobile phones and so on and make payments, regulations should be designed to intercept the future, not protect the past. And so often governments find themselves trying to come up with regulations studying history of the last 5 years. And in payments, most dramatically, the challenge for governments is how do you intercept the future in your regulations and build regulations for the future? So I think that is one very dramatic area where I think there is a challenge, and it's part of Visa's job to work with governments to enable that future of regulation.
Dougie, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, firstly, absolutely full support to everything my colleague Dr. Mwangi said, and a practical example of where that plays out for us. At the moment, a large number of consumer goods, and I think Phil was mentioning this also, the price points are sitting just above where the bulk of consumers are, and we need to bring that down. And those measures that Dr. Mwangi was referring to are a key way of doing that. And it also involves an understanding amongst policymakers, decision makers and regulators about how markets function and how that works, a move away from an economic nationalism to a thinking about where the markets are. I think most Africans would agree the lines were drawn artificially, and nowhere is that more apparent than when you're involved in a marketing and consumer goods role, so we need to do something to drop that. And a final point to add in is that we are at a tipping point that we see in the business where we are finally getting the kind of consumer data generated around payments, around usage, that we can actually use to genuinely drive a proper consumer model of Africa, whereas up until now we've been relatively pushing in the dark. So all support necessary to help collect and analyse and use that data.
Okay. Any other questions? There's one.
Yeah, thank you very much. I am Paul Ansa from Ghana. My question really flows from a comment that President Museveni made, that when they tried to go into the development of oil refinery, he was being discouraged by the development partners, as against Iran that was developing Building 17. There was a similar situation also in Ghana when the thought came about integrated...
I'm going to ask you to get to the question because we've got very little time.
Right.
So, yes.
An integrated aluminium industry in Ghana as well. And Ghana was being advised to shut down the current Volta Aluminium Company Limited. Now, how do we position this kind of advice from organizations we consider as development partners, to being discouraging Africa from going into processing and industrializing, so to speak, as against Africans' determination to emerge from its current situation as exporters of raw materials into processes or value addition of raw materials? How do we position this African aspiration side by side, the advice from development partners?
Okay. I think it's something that I mentioned before, maybe we haven't touched on enough, is the appropriateness. What sort of value addition would be most appropriate? And I think that's a very difficult question to answer, but maybe if you could attempt to answer that. James, in the light of what you heard, as I'm sure you hear a lot of this back home in Kenya.
Thank you very much. It is a challenge, and that the African continent needs to be able to handle. But you notice that advice is normally on the basis of the size of markets. So Africa can quickly solve that problem by creating more greater integration, such that the issue of small markets doesn't then arise. The second aspect is that Africa needs to invest more in its human capital. It is imperative that if you continue to seek advice from outsiders, it always tends to imply that you have no capacity of your own. And as was being said, if Africa could invest enormously in human capital, it may say thank you to such advice and do exactly what is appropriate for it based on the advice of its own citizens. So I think it will be important for Africa to invest in human capital.
Okay, thank you very much. We're fast running out of time, and so in conclusion, I'm supposed to conclude and draw to conclusion all that has been said, but since that's too vast, I'm going to delegate that job to the panelists, and I'm going to give you each 2 seconds each to say... 2 seconds. It's a big test. I'm joking, but okay. 10 seconds each to give, just say one thing that you think is really critical to ensuring the diversification of economies in Africa. It doesn't have to focus on the middle class, but just one thing from your businesses that you think is critical and that you need. Starting with you, Kwanzaa.
Yeah, I agree with other panels. Invest more in education.
In education, yeah. Okay. Dougie? And don't repeat that you also agree. I want something different.
Change your thinking. Top down to bottom up. Think of consumers, think of your markets, and base your policies around those.
Cameron?
Create more financially inclusive societies. People and entrepreneurship is alive and well. We just need to make this better. Carrying cash around and substitutes for cash will not work, and therefore payments and advancement in payments will be critical for that.
Phil?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think one of the things that we haven't talked about that's a big part of our investment in Africa is the liberalisation of the financial markets. So I'm sure James would be very supportive of that.
And I would say use the partnership model. Equity is a creation of partnerships. I'm very excited to be sitting with this panel, who all of them we work with in one way or another to build the diversification that we are supporting in the continent.
Okay. Thank you very much, all of you, and thank you for being such a polite and listening audience. And I think we've done our bit now, so we may leave, and please enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.